A mother is forced to face a cruel truth. Her own son is plotting to destroy their family. Can she save what's left, or will everything crumble at the hands of the one she once loved the most? The story begins when strange signs from David start to surface. You won't be able to take your eyes off this gripping tale where trust is betrayed and everything teeters on the edge of ruin. My name is Helen, 60 years old. I've devoted my entire life to my family. And I always believed that we were a happy, solid family with nothing that could break us apart. I remember the early mornings when the first light of dawn filtered through the window and lit up the small kitchen where I would make a cup of hot coffee while John, my husband, sat there with his rough hands and tired eyes, but full of love. After more than 40 years together, we had built a real home. John is the man I love, the one who has been with me through all the ups and downs of life. From the outside, our life seemed like a fairy tale. The little house in the suburbs, warm family dinners, afternoons when John and I walked hand in hand in the park, it seemed like nothing could ever change. I was an elementary school teacher, walking into the classroom every day with children who were innocent and full of hope. John was a carpenter. His hands could turn a scrap of wood into beautiful masterpieces. We had 2 sons, Ryan the eldest and David the younger one, 5 years younger than Ryan. Ryan was full of enthusiasm, always cheerful and hardworking. David, on the other hand, was quiet, reserved, and always made me anxious with something that I couldn't quite put into words. Although life seemed perfect, there was always a lingering sense of unease that never left me. I couldn't explain it, but every time I looked into David's eyes, I felt that something was wrong. He wasn't like Ryan, who was always affectionate and caring. David, on the other hand, kept his distance, and sometimes his gaze sent a chill down my spine. At dinner time, when the family gathered around the table, David always sat silently, not speaking or smiling, just staring at his plate. Ryan would often tell funny stories about school and friends, but David rarely participated. I had once thought that this was just the difference between 2 brothers, one being social and the other quiet. But as time passed, I began to realize that David's silence was not something simple. Every time Ryan talked about his plans for the future, I felt proud and at ease. But David was different. Even though he didn't say anything, I knew there was something in his eyes and words that I couldn't grasp. One day, when Ryan told us about his plan to go to university and study abroad, I could feel his joy in every word. But when I looked at David, I saw his coldness becoming clearer and clearer. Things started to change when Ryan entered adulthood. Some nights, I would wake up, look out the window, and see Ryan and David whispering to each other in the hallway. Whenever I approached, they would immediately stop talking. I didn't know what they were discussing, but a part of me started to worry. John always said it was just normal brotherly conversation, that everything would be fine, but there was a part of me that couldn't find peace. The event occurred one autumn night when Ryan didn't come home after an evening out. I stayed up all night waiting for him to return, but by late night he still hadn't come. David said he didn't know where Ryan was, that he was still studying in his room. I couldn't understand why he seemed so calm about it. Isn't it normal for someone to feel worried when they lose a brother, a family member? But David didn't. He just stayed silent, his eyes not betraying any emotion. The next morning, John and I decided to go out and search for Ryan. We visited all the places he usually went, but we couldn't find him. Finally, at dawn, they discovered that Ryan had died, his body lying at the bottom of a deep ravine, a place where no one had ever expected something like this to happen. The police said it was an accident, probably because Ryan got lost in the dark and fell down the ravine. At that moment, I didn't dare think too much. David was the quietest during the funeral. He didn't cry, He didn't show any sorrow. His expression made me feel cold. When Ryan passed away, everything in the family seemed to be turned upside down. David began to change, becoming more concerned about me and John, helping me with everything, doing whatever he could to fill the void that Ryan had left. But I couldn't shake off the strange feeling inside me. Was David trying to make up for something he had done? That uneasy feeling haunted me, but I tried to convince myself that it was just the grief of a son who had lost his brother. Yet, the more I thought about it, the more I realized that things were not what I thought. Everything changed when David began to make strange suggestions about changing John's and my will. I couldn't understand why he was so concerned about our assets, especially since this had never been an issue before. And then that uneasy feeling inside me started to rise again. Things were gradually becoming more complicated, and I couldn't understand what David was plotting. Ryan's death had changed everything in our family. After the funeral, everyone was busy with their own lives, but there was one thing I couldn't shake from my mind: David's strange transformation. He was no longer the son I once knew, the quiet one who kept his distance from everyone. Instead, David became overly concerned with me and John, helping me with everything, taking care of me as if I were a child. But I knew something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore the strange feeling inside me. One evening, while I was sitting at the dinner table thinking about everything, David came over to me. He sat down across from me, his eyes fixed on me as if waiting for a reaction. "Mom, I think we should talk about the family's assets," David said seriously, a tone that wasn't like how he usually spoke. "I know you and Dad have spent your entire lives building this, but as we get older, we can't work forever." I was surprised. Why was he talking about the family's assets right now? "What do you mean, David?" I asked, trying to keep calm. "Mom, I just want to make sure everything is divided fairly when we're not here anymore," David replied, but there was something in his eyes that made me feel uneasy. From that moment, David began to suggest that we change the will, talk about transferring assets, even changing the heir. This was truly strange. John wasn't too concerned. He always trusted our son, but I couldn't ignore the growing worry inside me. I started to sense something dangerous in David's words. They didn't sound like the concern I had for my son. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like there was a mask slowly slipping off. A few weeks later, I decided to investigate the changes in the family's bank accounts. I went through the paperwork and found several strange things. Unclear sums of money. There were transactions I didn't remember making or where they had come from. I turned to John, but he wasn't very interested, saying it was probably just routine spending. But in my heart, I couldn't feel at ease. I began to feel that something was off, an unease I couldn't explain. One day when David came to visit us, I couldn't stay silent anymore. "David, why are you so concerned about the family's assets? You know we're not rich, but everything your dad and I have done is to give you a good life," I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. David just smiled, but it wasn't like before. "Mom, I just want to make sure everything is fine for you and Dad when you get older. I want you to not worry about money," he replied, but I noticed the tension in his voice. "What have you done with the family's money?" I asked seriously. David paused for a moment, then continued, "Mom, I'm just helping our family. I want you both to live comfortably." But there was something in David's words that made me feel threatened. Why would he talk about living comfortably when I knew that we had always lived well enough and didn't need to change anything? That question lingered in my mind. A part of me tried to convince myself that he was just a son concerned for his parents, but another part of me couldn't ignore the suspicion, the signs that I couldn't overlook. One evening, I accidentally overheard a conversation between David and Emily, his wife. They were whispering in the living room, and when I got close, they immediately stopped talking. Although they tried to hide it, I could sense the tension in the air. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Emily's glance toward me and David's cold demeanor made me feel like something was wrong. After they left, I began to think of the worst possibilities. Were they planning something, or was I just imagining things? That night, I couldn't sleep. Thoughts of David kept circling in my mind, and I couldn't find peace. He was my son, but why did I feel scared when I was near him? Why did it feel like I was being watched by a stranger, not the child I had raised all these years? That night, as I sat in the living room, John entered with a worried look on his face. "Helen, you're not okay. I know something is bothering you, but I don't know how to help. David is our son. You can trust him," he said. I looked into his eyes, and that fear rose inside me again. "Don't you see anything strange? Why is David so interested in our assets? Why is he talking about the will, about money? Doesn't it seem off to you?" John looked at me, his eyes filled with confusion. "Maybe you're overthinking, but if you're really worried, I'll talk to David." The next morning, John and David had a long conversation. I didn't know what they said, but when David left, I noticed he seemed different. The wave of suspicion returned to me. What I once thought was a perfect family now seemed to be falling apart piece by piece. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in a bad dream where I had no control over anything. And then David did something that I could no longer ignore. He demanded that we change the entire will and divide the assets fairly. His words felt like a punch to the face. But John seemed unfazed, still trusting David. This made me feel more alone and confused than ever. The big question remained, what did David really want? I no longer had time to think. The doubts, the tension, and the fear had grown too big to ignore. Secrets couldn't stay buried forever, and I had to uncover the truth before it was too late. Family life, which had once seemed so peaceful, was no longer something I recognized. David was no longer the son I had known. He had changed, and this change couldn't simply be attributed to Ryan's death. The more I thought about it, the larger that unease became pressing in on me day by day. One evening, when David and Emily came to visit, I decided to do something that I had been postponing for a long time. I silently followed them, eavesdropping on their conversation. I knew I couldn't keep living in uncertainty, and I needed to know the truth. When they entered the living room, I quickly hid behind the door and listened to every word they said. "We need to solve this quickly, David," I heard Emily's voice, anxious and full of urgency. "Mom and Dad are getting too old to recognize what's happening. We have to stick to the plan. If we don't, everything will be ruined." I felt a sharp shock in my chest. These words, I never expected them to come from Emily, who I had always thought of as a good wife, a vital part of the family. She had a plan, and David was carrying it out. "I know," replied coldly. "As long as everything goes according to plan, I won't have any issues. Everything is under control." I felt a chill in the air as he spoke. It was as if he had no remorse, no care for the people who had once loved him. I couldn't listen anymore. It was all too clear now. David and Emily were not just plotting something, they were actively making it happen. The next morning, I began to act. John still didn't notice the change in David. He always thought his son was just going through a tough time. But I knew that the truth was not so simple. We had to do something. We had to stop David before he pushed everything beyond the point of no return. When I met with John, I told him everything. The change in David's behavior, the conversations I overheard. John was silent, thinking for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was filled with concern. "Helen, maybe I've overlooked something important, but now we can't just sit back and watch. We need to find a way to protect our family. John's words were a wake-up call, and I knew I couldn't just stay quiet anymore. From that day on, I had to act more decisively. The fear that had controlled me couldn't do so any longer. I couldn't let David and Emily continue deceiving us. I couldn't let them take everything. I had to do whatever it took to protect what we had built. That night, I couldn't sleep. David's words echoed in my mind like a wound that wouldn't heal. David was no longer my son. He was someone else, someone I couldn't recognize. His plans were no longer small changes in his behavior, but a ruthless betrayal. Everything I had done for him, all the love and sacrifices, now seemed meaningless. David can't be like this, I told myself, trying to control my emotions. But I couldn't hide the truth. My son was changing, and I had to face the painful reality. He was ready to do anything to take our family's wealth, and as a mother, I couldn't stand by and watch him destroy everything we had. The next morning, I met with John. I needed to make things clear before it was too late. John still didn't see the changes in David. He thought his son was just going through a tough period. But I knew that the truth wasn't that simple. We had to do something. We had to stop David before he destroyed everything. When I told John everything from David's behavior change to the conversations I had overheard, he sat in silence for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was full of concern. Helen, maybe I've missed something important, but now we can't just stand by. We need to find a way to protect our family. John's words were a wake-up call, and I knew I couldn't sit idle anymore. From that moment on, I had to act more decisively. The fear that had controlled me couldn't control me anymore. I couldn't let David and Emily keep deceiving us. I had to protect what we had built. Days later, I decided to face David once again. This time, I wasn't going to just talk quietly. I was going to force him to face the truth. I invited him to the house again, and I knew that this would be the last time I would face him without being prepared. When David arrived, I immediately told him everything I had been feeling. "David, it's time for us to talk," I said firmly. "What are you doing to this family? You've changed too much, and I can't continue living with these doubts anymore." David looked at me with that cold expression, with no emotion at all. He didn't say a word, just stood there in silence. I couldn't recognize my son in his gaze. "What are you doing with our family, David?" I asked again, unable to stay calm any longer. David didn't answer right away. After a long moment, he finally spoke in a calm, emotionless voice. "Mom, I'm just doing what needs to be done. It's time for this family to change. I'm just trying to help secure our future." Those words, though soft, hit me like a punch to the heart. He was no longer my son, the son I had trusted. "I will never let you take everything we've built," I said, my voice shaking with anger and pain. "So you won't stop, will you?" I asked, challenging him. David didn't say anything else. He just looked at me for a long time before finally stepping back and giving me a slight smirk. That smirk made me feel like I'd been struck, but I couldn't stop now. I was ready to face the truth no matter how painful it was. Everything was clear now. David and Emily were planning to take our family's fortune, and as a mother, I couldn't let them continue. That day, I met David and Emily in a quiet cafe, a place I had never imagined being the setting for such a confrontation. The atmosphere around us was tense. Each word felt like an attack on my heart. David still wore that cold expression, as though nothing that had happened before had ever made him feel that what he was doing was wrong. As for Emily, she sat in silence, saying nothing, but I could sense the calculating look in her eyes. A light wave of fear rose within me as though something terrible was about to happen. David started to speak, his voice as calm as ever. "Mom, Dad, I don't want this to go any further. Everything I'm doing is for the family. You don't understand. I don't want to harm anyone, but this is necessary," he said, his voice sharp and cold. His words knocked me back. This wasn't the sudden change in behavior I had expected. It wasn't just a fleeting phase. He had always been calculating, but I never imagined it would be this bad. As for Emily, she finally spoke her words, sending a chill down my spine. "Helen, don't be so tense. We just want to settle this smoothly. Think about the future of our family. Why are you holding on to all of these assets when we need to move forward?" She said, her voice sharp, not the sweet tone I had known her for. Her words left me speechless. Emily had shown her true nature. She wasn't the kind-hearted woman I once thought she was. She was a manipulator just like David. I looked at David, then Emily. The air around us seemed to freeze. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall broke the silence. My mind was in turmoil. I was facing a battle within myself between being a mother and being logical. I couldn't let them destroy this family. I couldn't let everything fall into the hands of people I had once loved. "I will never let you take everything," I said, my voice firm and resolute. "You may deceive Dad and me, but you cannot deceive yourselves. David, you are no longer the son I raised. You've changed, and I will not sit back and watch you destroy everything." David stared at me, his gaze no longer one of anger, but of indifference. "Mom, you really don't understand. What you're saying no longer matters. I've already made my decision," he said, his voice steady. Those words shattered me. He had made his choice, and I could no longer change it. But I wasn't going to let him continue. I was prepared to face this head-on, no matter what it cost. I couldn't imagine living the rest of my life seeing David and Emily at every corner, at every meal, at every holiday, while they were secretly pushing me into a situation I couldn't escape. I had once trusted my son David, the one I had nurtured and sacrificed for, the one I had hoped would grow into a strong, independent man. But now David stood before me, speaking cold, calculated words. What I was feeling was not just the betrayal of a son, but the fundamental change in everything I had believed in. Since I confronted David and Emily at the cafe, everything had shifted. We weren't just letting go of happy memories anymore. We were facing a difficult and dangerous battle. A part of me didn't want to believe what they were doing, but the other part, the one I couldn't ignore, knew that there was no turning back. The next morning when I woke up, the sunlight shone into the room, but I couldn't feel its warmth. Everything around me felt unfamiliar, empty. I sat still for a while, not wanting to move, not wanting to face anything. Everything I once wanted was no longer there. I looked at my phone, where I had received a call from John the night before. On the other end of the line, I heard his calm, worried voice. "Helen, we need to talk. I feel like things are going too far." I had nothing left to lose. A decision had to be made. I grabbed the phone and called John back, my heart heavy. "I know things can't stay like this, right?" I asked, not hiding the fear in my voice. "You've done something, haven't you?" John asked, his voice full of concern. "Are you sure you want to do this? You can't just let them go without consequences." "No, John, I have no choice. David and Emily are too greedy. They won't stop. If I don't act now, they'll take everything I said, with determination I didn't even know I had." After that call, I felt as though a door had opened. I needed help. All this time, I had trusted David, believed in family, but now I had to stand up for myself. This battle couldn't be won alone. Immediately, I reached out to a few old friends I trusted completely. Maya was the only one I could think of at that moment. She was a talented lawyer, and I knew she could help me through this. Maya had always been there for me in tough times, and this time was no different. We met at a small cafe where I couldn't hide the anxiety on my face. I looked into Maya's eyes, and she knew I was carrying a heavy fear. "Helen, I understand, but you have to remember you can't do this alone. People like David and Emily are dangerous. They won't hesitate to destroy everything," she said, pausing for a moment before looking straight at me. "I'll help you, but you need to be more careful. What I help you with won't just be legal, it'll be a survival strategy." We discussed the next steps. She promised to help me gather evidence, find loopholes in David and Emily's actions. But I also knew that to win, I had to face my biggest fear, the betrayal of my own son. Maya emphasized that in this situation, every move had to be carefully calculated. We couldn't let them find out that I had uncovered their plot, or things would become even more complicated. She promised to help me collect the necessary information, and from there I could expose David's plans. I had no choice but to trust her and follow her guidance. When I returned home, John was there waiting for me. He was sitting quietly in the living room, a cold cup of tea in his hand. I looked at him and I could see the worry and love in his eyes. "Helen, do you really want to fight this battle? Are you sure?" he asked in a gentle but serious tone. "You're right. But I can't just sit here and let David and Emily continue like this. I've already lost so much. I can't lose more," I said, feeling a new strength building within me. I had decided silence was no longer an option. This wasn't just a fight for my family, it was a fight for my dignity and self-respect. As everything began to lead up to important decisions, I couldn't help but look back at the past to find clues about what was happening in my family. Even though I tried to focus on the next steps and face David and Emily, our past was unavoidable, and it had begun to resurface, forcing me into a battle not only with David, but also with myself. Ryan, my eldest son, had always been the source of joy and happiness in our family. He was the epitome of energy, enthusiasm, and always ready to take care of everyone. He and David, despite being brothers, had completely different personalities. Ryan was always open, wanting to connect and share the little joys in life. But David, he was quiet, reserved, and sometimes there was an unspoken silence that left me feeling uneasy. When he was young, I always took pride in him, believing he was the child I could trust. Even though he wasn't as outspoken, he was still an essential part of the family. But now I realized that the past, which I had always trusted, was actually hiding painful truths. I remembered the day Ryan died, a day that still left a hollow emptiness in my heart. Ryan's death wasn't just a tremendous loss for us, it was a shock that I couldn't imagine. How could everything around me change so suddenly? Ryan died in an accident, or so the police said. His death was attributed to a misstep in the dark and falling into a ravine. But the more I thought about it, the more I felt something wasn't right. David hadn't shown any signs of mourning. He remained silent, even at the funeral. No tears, no signs of grief. That didn't seem like my son. The cold glances from David, the unnatural silence during those moments, I couldn't forget them. I began to wonder, could David have been involved in Ryan's death? Maybe he killed Ryan for some reason. I knew this thought seemed insane, but I couldn't shake the feeling in my heart. Every time I looked into David's eyes, I felt like there was something he was hiding, a terrible secret he didn't want me to uncover. I hadn't shared these suspicions with John because he always dismissed them, thinking they were just irrational fears from a worried mother. But I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. When David started acting strangely after Ryan's death, my suspicions grew. He suddenly became overly attentive to me and John, helping me with everything, doing all the household chores. It felt like he was trying to make up for something he had done. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just grief over losing his brother. There was something deeper, something I couldn't quite understand. David's change in behavior became clearer as time passed. He began asking about our assets, suggesting changes to our will. These questions really unsettled me. We had never talked about money or inheritance before, and now David was pushing for changes in the will, splitting up the property. It felt like there was a shadow hanging over our family, as if everything was being manipulated by secret plans that I couldn't fully understand. One night, as I sat alone, I started thinking about the old days, the evenings when the family was still whole. I remembered when Ryan was alive, when everything felt intact and the peace in my heart. But everything changed after Ryan died. What I had thought was peace and unity in our family was now just broken fragments of the past. And I realized that Ryan's death wasn't an accident. It was the first step in a much larger plan, a plan that David and Emily had set into motion long before. The truth began to emerge when I discovered that David had been secretly withdrawing money from our accounts. Strange transactions, sums of money I couldn't remember spending or reasons for, made me feel increasingly uneasy. That feeling had become an obsession, one I couldn't stop thinking about. David and Emily weren't just trying to control our assets, they wanted everything we had built. As I continued my investigation, I discovered important documents that David had been hiding. Large sums of money he had transferred into his private accounts, contracts I hadn't been aware of, all pointing to the fact that he had a well-thought-out plan. He didn't just want to control our assets, he wanted to seize them all. Everything was part of a carefully crafted plot with no room for coincidence. David's behavior wasn't just betrayal, it was a massive deception. The betrayal of my own son, the one I had raised and loved for so many years. And as I started to realize the truth, I knew I couldn't stand by and watch him continue to deceive our family. I couldn't let him destroy everything I had worked for. My suspicions and worries were now undeniable truths, and I had to act immediately before it was too late. I had known that one day I would have to face the truth, no matter how painful it would be, but I never imagined that my own son would be the one behind all the dark secrets. Everything I had believed to be perfect in my family had now crumbled into pieces. I couldn't just stand by and let David continue to exploit us without taking action. The decision had to be made, and it couldn't wait any longer. I had to find the evidence. I had to expose the truth before everything was destroyed by David and Emily. After my final confrontation with David, when I had faced the truth about what he was doing, I could no longer remain silent. I couldn't live in fear and uncertainty. I had to do something right away. At that moment, I understood that David wasn't just my son anymore. He was the enemy trying to destroy this family, and I couldn't let that continue. I reached out to a lawyer I had known for a long time, someone I trusted completely. Maya, an old friend, was the only person I could think of at that moment. She was a talented lawyer, and I knew she could help me navigate this situation. Maya had always been there for me during difficult times, and now she was no exception. We met at a small cafe where I couldn't hide my anxiety on my face. I looked into Maya's eyes, and she knew I was carrying a huge fear inside me. "Helen, I understand. But you have to remember, you can't do this alone. People like David and Emily are dangerous. They won't hesitate to destroy everything," she said, pausing for a moment before looking straight at me. "I'll help you, but you need to be more careful. What I help you with won't just be legal, it'll be a survival strategy." We discussed the next steps. She promised to help me gather evidence, find loopholes in David and Emily's actions. But I also knew that to win, I had to face my biggest fear, the betrayal of my own son. Maya emphasized that in this situation, every move had to be carefully calculated. We couldn't let them find out that I had uncovered their plot, or things would become even more complicated. She promised to help me collect the necessary information, and from there I could expose David's plans. I had no choice but to trust her and follow her guidance. When I returned home, John was there waiting for me. He was sitting quietly in the living room, a cold cup of tea in his hand. I looked at him, and I could see the worry and love in his eyes. "Helen, do you really want to fight this battle? Are you sure?" he asked in a gentle but serious tone. "You're right, but I can't just sit here and let David and Emily continue like this. I've already lost so much. I can't lose more," I said, feeling a new strength building within me. I had decided silence was no longer an option. This wasn't just a fight for my family, it was a fight for my dignity and self-respect. When I looked into David's eyes for the last time, I no longer saw the son I had once loved. Instead, I saw a stranger, someone willing to sacrifice everything for their own gain. He was no longer my son. He had become an enemy, someone trying to take everything I had spent my life building. All the signs, all the transactions I had uncovered led to an undeniable truth, David. And Emily weren't just planning to seize the family's assets, they were scheming to harm the very people who had nurtured and protected them. But the truth wasn't easily accepted. The cost wasn't just in arguments or broken relationships. It was the psychological pain that I couldn't erase. Over the years, I had raised David, taught him, loved him like any other mother would. And now I had to face the betrayal of my own son. Immediately after the confrontation with David, I knew I couldn't just sit back and watch him continue doing whatever he wanted. With Maya's help, we began to act immediately. The evidence we had collected, the documents about the unusual transactions, were enough to bring David and Emily to justice. I couldn't let them continue destroying my family, and I couldn't let their schemes unfold without facing the consequences. Maya helped me find the loopholes in David's financial documents, the large sums of money he had withdrawn, the contracts I had no knowledge of, everything connected in a web of crimes. They had been planning this for far too long. We couldn't let this end easily. I knew I had to do everything I could to stop David before it went too far. Deciding to report to the police wasn't easy, but I had no other choice. I couldn't let David continue to exploit our family. Everything had gone too far, and now I had to face the truth once again. I wouldn't let my son, the one I had raised, harm my family any longer. After all the evidence had been gathered, Maya and I met with a trusted police officer. We presented everything we had found, and after a careful review, the officer decided to open an investigation. This was the first step toward bringing David and Emily to justice. That night, I couldn't sleep. The images of David and Emily kept swirling in my mind. David's cold words, Emily's calculating gaze, these things wouldn't let me find peace. I couldn't believe that my own family had become my enemy, but I knew I had done the right thing. If I didn't act, they would continue deceiving and destroying everything I had built. The investigation took several days, and the truths the police uncovered sent chills down my spine. David hadn't just exploited our family, he had secretly made shady deals for years. He had been trying to control our assets using the trust I had given him. The secret transactions, the unexplained transfers, all of it came to light. And Emily, his wife, wasn't innocent either. She had been behind these plans, helping David deceive us. When the police made the decision to arrest David and Emily, I didn't feel happy. I only felt a profound sense of relief. Finally, justice had been served. They were arrested at home, and their schemes were fully exposed. David admitted to everything from seizing the assets to causing Ryan's death, which he had concealed for all these years. He confessed that Ryan's death hadn't been an accident. It had been a deliberate act. My son's death wasn't just a tragic loss. It had been the beginning of a dark plot that I could never have imagined. When David was arrested, I felt like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But I couldn't ignore the deep sadness that washed over me. My son, the one I had loved and nurtured for all these years, had become a traitor. The price he had to pay was steep, and I wasn't sure if I could ever live with that feeling. Still, I knew I had done the right thing. I couldn't let greed and betrayal take everything I had loved. Emily, David's accomplice, was also arrested. She couldn't escape the truth. All the sweet words, all the games she had played with my family were laid bare. Emily admitted that she had been complicit with David all along, helping him carry out these secret transactions and covering up their crimes. They had planned to seize the family's wealth, and now they had to face the consequences. Though I didn't feel joy at seeing David and Emily arrested, I understood that it was necessary. Justice had been served, and my family wouldn't have to live in fear and suspicion anymore. But the price we had paid was too high. I had lost the son I had loved, lost the trust in my family, and I didn't know if I could ever regain what I had lost. After David and Emily were arrested, everything in my family seemed to have changed forever. The life I had once trusted, that felt secure, now lay in pieces, broken memories that could never be pieced back together. When I looked at the young children in the family, the innocent grandchildren I was now taking care of, I couldn't help but wonder, would they ever understand what had happened? Would they be able to see this family as whole again, as it once was? David, my son, had done unforgivable things. The price he had to pay was too high, not just for the crimes he had committed, but for the price I had to pay in seeing my own son betray the family, betray the love I had given him. I couldn't extinguish the sadness in my heart, even though I knew justice had been served. He was my son, but now he had become my enemy, someone who had tried to take everything I had worked for. After the investigation ended, David and Emily were sentenced. David, the son I had raised, taught, and loved for all these years, now faced a life sentence. He couldn't deny his crimes anymore. Everything had become clear. Ryan's death, the fraudulent transactions, the conspiracy to seize our assets, all of it had been exposed in full. I couldn't imagine that all of this had come from my own son. But the price I had to pay was even greater. After David was arrested, my family was no longer a family. I could no longer look at my loved ones without feeling a deep rift in my heart. John, my husband, had tried so hard, but I knew he couldn't overcome this pain either. He had always trusted David, always thought our son would be the one to protect our family. But now we had to face the greatest betrayal we had ever known. Life in the family became unbearably quiet. The meals were no longer joyful. The conversations were no longer warm like before. Each day that passed, I felt like I was living in an entirely different world. The wounds in my heart couldn't heal, and I couldn't look at David without feeling a deep sense of shame. He hadn't just betrayed me. He had betrayed everything I had built over my entire life. I began to realize that even with all the evidence and the justice that had been carried out, I couldn't escape the feeling of betrayal. Not just from David, but from my entire family, from the promises and the love I had given them. The price I had to pay wasn't just the loss of my son. It was the loss of trust in the people I had loved and sacrificed everything for. When I looked at the innocent grandchildren, I couldn't help but feel heartbroken. They didn't deserve to grow up in a broken family, to live under the shadow of betrayal and pain. I decided I would raise them, give them a better life, a place where they could feel love, not like the life I had lived with John. But no matter how hard I tried, the wounds in my heart couldn't heal. Each day that passed, I couldn't forget the image of David standing there, cold and unrepentant. He had disappointed me. He had taken away my trust in everything I had built. I didn't know if I could continue living with this feeling. How could I continue to love someone who had hurt me so deeply, John? And I began living a quiet life, still together, but no longer the same couple we once were. Our relationship had been deeply affected by Ryan's death and David's betrayal. John tried to comfort me, but I knew he was struggling with his own thoughts too. Both of us were in pain, but we couldn't do anything to change the truth. One morning, when I was sitting alone in our quiet room, I wondered if I could keep living with this truth. Could I continue loving and protecting my family when everything I had once trusted had been shattered? I knew I couldn't live in the past forever, but how could I move forward when the wounds were still fresh? Every time I looked at our old family photo, at the memories we once had, I felt a pain I couldn't shake off. Those memories had once been my solace, but now they only brought sorrow. And then one day, when I stood at the door of our home, looking at the innocent children I was raising, I made a decision. I would not let these wounds take over my life. I had to be strong for them, for what I still had. David and Emily may have taken everything I loved, but I wouldn't let them take away the love and hope I could still offer my family. I decided to continue raising the children, to give them a peaceful life, a life untouched by the painful truths of the past. I wouldn't let David and Emily continue destroying what I had built. The battles, the painful truths, I would face them with strength because I knew that my family could still be saved as long as I didn't give up. Life would never be the same as it once was, but I would not let this betrayal take me down. David and Emily,